chapter 19, verses 16 through 22. John chapter 19, starting in verse 16. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Here they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on each side and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews," but that this man claimed to be the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." The next passage is from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. "For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with words of human wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. For the message of the cross is foolish to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." The next passage is 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. "When I came to you, brothers, I did not come with eloquence or superior wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness and fear, and with much trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith may not rest on men's wisdom, but on God's power." And then lastly, I'll be reading from Romans 1, verse 16. "I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jews, then for the Gentile." May God bless the reading of his word.
Thank you, Tanya. So we are going to, as hopefully you picked up on, be going through the good news of Jesus. It is odd that the good news is that he died. I've hopefully reminded you of this throughout the weeks, that what's peculiar about the good news that is at the center of all doctrine, it's at the center of our statement of faith, it's at the center of our whole life, is that the good news is actually composed of the worst day in the history of the world. And I find that encouraging, knowing that God creates the best news out of the worst days. And this certainly had to be the worst day when the creatures killed their creator on the hill of Calvary, Golgotha, the place of the skull. And for the Christian, this should be powerful. And so we're going to look at whether or not this is powerful to you. For most of you it is. Perhaps for some of you it's folly. It's just foolishness. And we'll get to that in a minute. But first, I want to introduce the gospel story with somewhat of a prophetic proverb. Proverbs 29:10 says, "Bloodthirsty men hate one who is blameless and seek the life of the upright." And that's what we've been seeing happen in the gospel in John 18 and 19 as it unfolds, as the Jewish leaders, bloodthirsty, hate Jesus, the righteous one, the blameless one, and seek to put him to death. Psalm 37:32-33 also epitomizes the gospel here in John 18 and 19, as it says, "The wicked watches for the righteous and seeks to put him to death. The Lord will not abandon him to his power or let him be condemned when he is brought to trial." And yet here's the gospel twist. God does let Jesus be condemned as the righteous one when he's brought to trial. Why? For our sake. As 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, "For our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. And so God lets Jesus, the righteous one, be put to death when he's put to trial so that we could be brought to life. And of course we know God does bring Jesus to life. And so when you read there they crucified him, you have the innocent being tried as the guilty. Now for us who are Christians, this should be powerful news, because we realize that we are the guilty, or we were the guilty, and we needed somebody to take our place and to pay for our sins in a righteous, true way. So that should be powerful, and that's what 1 Corinthians 1:18 gets at. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. That's saying right now, the cross should be powerful to you. It should be good news. And so my prayer is that this message would be seasoned with power in your life, and it would come across as powerful, because boy, do you need this. Do you need to be reminded that you are being saved still through the power of the cross. So let me pray, and then we're going to go through this gospel narrative. Father, we thank you that you have given us the record of this good news, and that we can have it reported to us by John, the Apostle John, but written down through your Spirit. And God, now I pray that you would report this good news to our hearts, that you would preach it to our innermost being, and that we would be cut to the heart, Lord, knowing that the significance of the cross, not only as a historical event, but as a life event for us too, as it was the day when you created new birth in us. So God, please guide our ears and our hearts as we listen to your Spirit speak to your people. In Jesus' name, amen. So, the gospel, folly or power. In John 19:16, we begin, so he delivered him over to them to be crucified. That is, Pilate delivers Jesus over to the Jews to be crucified. That is, to their will. But he also delivers Jesus over to the soldiers in order to carry out the plan of the Jews. And so the soldiers took Jesus. I want to just quickly recap what has happened here. In the words of Peter in Acts 3:13 to 15, he recaps the whole situation of this trial of Jesus, which leads him to death. He says, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, the God of our fathers, he's speaking to the Jews, he glorified his servant Jesus, whom you delivered over and denied in the presence of Pilate when he had decided to release him. But you denied the holy and righteous one and asked for a murderer to be granted to you, that is Barabbas. And you killed the author of life, whom God raised from the dead. To this we are witnesses. So remember that Pilate delivers Jesus over to the Jews and their wish. Pilate did not want to kill Jesus because he knew that he was an innocent man. He says it multiple times. What wrong has this man committed? I find no guilt in him. I find no guilt in him. Pilate knew that Jesus wasn't guilty. And so he didn't want to put him to death. But remember, Pilate was in this dilemma. Do what's right and let Jesus go free, but risk a riot forming as the Jews blackmail Pilate, and they tell him, if you let this man free, Jesus, you're no friend of Caesar. Okay, they're telling Pilate that Jesus is guilty of sedition, meaning his kingship is one that's going to rebel against Rome. And so Pilate, if he does what's right, he will not be able to keep the peace, which is one of the oaths he made as a Roman governor, to keep the peace. And so he'd break that if he did what's right. But if he does what's wrong and he gives Jesus over to the Jews' wishes, the problem with that is that even though he solves the problem of a riot forming by pleasing the Jews, he's still doing what's wrong. And according to Rome's standards, Pilate's also responsible for doing justice. And so he is in a pickle where either way, Pilate is going to have to break his oath before Rome. And yet this trap, I want to remind you, is not a trap created by people or lucky chance, but it's a trap created by God himself. As Acts 2:23 says this, Jesus delivered up according to this definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. So you have God planning all of this out so that Jesus will be crucified. And so they took Jesus, and in verse 17, he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. In between verse 16 and 17, between going out and bearing his own cross, we're told according to the other Gospels that Jesus is going to receive another flogging, another beating. Remember, the first one he received as a mockery from Pilate in order to try to seek to satisfy the Jews and hopefully release Jesus, so as to show them this beat up and bruised man who is their so-called king, and to say, look at your so-called king, this guy that you say is a risk to Rome. Look at him now, all beat up and weak and bruised. He's no threat. And he was hoping that the Jews would just be satisfied with that and let him go, but it didn't work. So what I'm trying to say is Jesus will be beat a second time, and this second flogging would have been worse. So much that many crucified victims wouldn't even make it to crucifixion because they would die during this beating. And this is the second one that Jesus is enduring, okay? So he's weakened. And in verse 17, and so he went out after being beaten again, bearing his own cross, to the place called the place of the skull. And what this would look like is, if you can imagine the cross behind me, Jesus would be carrying the horizontal piece of the cross to his resting place, to his execution place, and the vertical beam would be ready, already posted in the ground, waiting for him. Now we're told, according to the other Gospels, again, that Jesus couldn't make the trip, and that a man named Simon of Cyrene was voluntold to carry the cross for Jesus the rest of his way. And so that's what happens until he comes to the place called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. So this place looks like a skull. I visited Israel once as a cross-cultural trip and saw the place where Jesus might have been crucified. It does look like a skull. We're not sure. The other possibility is where this church was built, because people tended to build churches on top of historical sacred places where biblical events went on. So that might be the place, in which case you don't get the feeling of, this is where Jesus was crucified. Whatever the case is, Jesus was crucified at this place called the place of the skull. And then we're told in Aramaic it's called Golgotha. That's a transliteration, Greek transliteration of the Aramaic word, okay? And then it's the transliteration over into English. If that's confusing you, just remember, it's a different language for place of the skull, Golgotha, all right? Side note, that word Calvary in our language, Calvary, we use it for churches, Calvary Bible Church, and we talk about how Jesus was crucified at the hill of Calvary. That word Calvary is the Latin word for place of the skull. And so that's why we actually use the word Calvary. It's our transliteration of the Latin word skull. So anyways, Jesus is being crucified at the place of the skull. And then they crucified him. There they crucified him. Now, at this point, I want to point out how we're told very little about what this was. I mean, we're not told about the gory details or just all of the terrible, miserable details of the cross. We're not told about the physical anguish. In all of the Gospels, you find that the Gospel writers are brief, and they say, just there they crucified him. And the reason for that is because the purpose of Christ's mission was not physical anguish, but it was spiritual. It was judicial. It was to forgive us. And so we're not told the details of the physical anguish. We're told details about really the identification that Jesus was doing at this point to identify with us. Although if you look back at John 18:11, you will notice that what Jesus is accepting on the cross is a cup. He says, "Will I not receive the cup that the Father has given to me?" That cup, if you study it through Scripture, for instance, I think it's Psalm 76, it is a cup of judgment. And so what was Jesus doing on the cross? He was being judged for us. He's being judged in our place. He's being treated like the criminal, like the guilty, which we are. He's dying in our place, although he himself is righteous. But look at who he identifies with. John 19:18, it says, "And with him 2 others, he was crucified with 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus between them." Picture this. Jesus is being crucified with 2 criminals, and they would have been criminals on either side of him, and he himself is dying in the place of another notorious criminal who could have been considered a terrorist, Barabbas. I just want to point out that Jesus is identifying with sinners here. The righteous one, the holy one, the perfect one, who can't even look on sin, is becoming sin here for us and is identifying himself with sinners. Are you willing to identify with him? Jesus is identifying himself with sinners. Are you willing to identify your life in public with the righteous one, with Jesus? Think about this. Jesus is publicly in front of thousands of people, because this is Passover. Thousands of people are flooding into Jerusalem at this time. And he's in a public area, on a hill, raised up, and he's identifying himself with sinners. He's identifying himself with you. Are you willing to identify yourself with him, the righteous one, in public? As Romans 1:16 says, "I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it's the power of God to those who believe." But sometimes we are ashamed of the gospel. But God was not ashamed of you. Or if he was, he did something so that he could identify with us, so that he could save us, wash us up, and make us his own. Now, at this point, Jesus is also fulfilling Isaiah 53:12, which says, "Because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors." Here he is numbering himself with the transgressors for you and me. Now, the significance, I want you to make sure that you know that as he identifies himself and fills himself with criminals around him, and in place of one who should be in his place, that it's not unrelated to you or me. If you consider, I'm a good person. Well, 1 Peter 3:18 describes what the significance of this moment is. As it says, "Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the righteous, that he might bring us to God." That he might bring us to God. This is for us. And then you have 1 Peter 2:24, which says, "He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds we have been healed." So in other words, that is to say, it should have been us, surrounding him and in the place of him. And if you're saying, "Well, it couldn't be me," Romans 3:23 says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." And so you're a part of the all. I'm a part of the all. And if I haven't said my point well enough yet, Galatians 3:13 says, "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, as it is written, 'Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree.'" He became the curse for us. That is to say, it should have been us. He substituted our life. Now, at this point, I want to ask you, 1 Corinthians 1:18, is this word of the cross folly to you, or is it power to you? It's folly if you say, "No, it shouldn't have been me." I don't understand. I don't really deserve that level of punishment, to be crucified or to be judged and put to death like a criminal. Well, we've all broken God's law. And so, yes, the wages of sin is death. So it should have been us. But for the Christian, I would imagine 99% of us, this is power, because we realize he saved me there. This is where he's saving me. This is where it should have been me. Now, another thing I want to show you is the royal dynamic of Jesus on the cross. Notice how Pilate then, as Jesus is being crucified, wrote this inscription and put it on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Did you know that the cross is like Christ's scepter? It is like, it's where the power of our King reigns and rules. It's A.W. Pink who writes this about Christ showing off his kingdom on the cross. He says, "Here is indeed God's king, king in death and in life, here in a peculiar way affirmed, his cross henceforth to be the very sign of his power, the scepter of under which they bow in adoring homage." This is where Jesus shows off his kingship the most. And if you remember the whole scene of the gospel, according to John, he has been trying to highlight the theme of Christ's power and control and royal kingship. For instance, if you back up to chapter 8, remember when Jesus is being arrested by the soldiers, he controls the conversation. And instead of the soldiers interrogating him, he interrogates the soldiers and says, "Who do you seek?" They say, "Jesus of Nazareth." He says, "I am he." They fall down. So they get up and he asks again, "Who do you seek?" And they say, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he says, "I am he. Let my people go." He's completely in control of his death and arrest because he's the king. And then he gets into a conversation with Pilate as Pilate's interrogating him. And again, Jesus kind of takes the upper hand and he asks Pilate, "Do you ask this question, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' because you're really interested or because people have told you?" And he's always showing that he's the king. He's the one in charge of his death. And then he gets into a second conversation with Jesus, or Pilate does. And in the second conversation, Jesus tells Pilate, "You would have no authority over me unless it was given to you. And oh, by the way, the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." So you have just Jesus showing that he's both king and he's judge as he's going through this process. And the kingship of Jesus culminates here on the cross as Pilate inscribes Jesus, King of the Jews. And really what Pilate is doing is he's fulfilling the truth. Pilate would have said that out of sarcasm, to remember, kind of continue to jab at the Jews and tell them, "Hey, this is your king. Look at your king that you're crucifying." And they would have been embarrassed by it, right? To see King of the Jews over a crucified man. Think about what people would think about the Jews as they pass by. This is your king, and he's being crucified? What a rotten king you have. So Pilate, to keep in step with the rest of his spirit behind the whole trial of Jesus, is just jabbing one more blow to the Jews by writing this inscription, "Jesus, King of the Jews." But what Pilate writes in sarcasm, God overrules for truth, because Jesus is being killed for being King of the Jews. That's the only reason he's being killed. He is King of the Jews. And it's at this point, Jesus on his cross, that he draws us into his kingdom to make us his subjects, because the perfect king can't have imperfect subjects. So verse 20, we're told many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek. I just want to draw out an illustration from this point. I believe it's a spirit-wrought illustration, and that's the fact that you see that the extent of Christ's kingship on the cross, and how he's not only King of the Jews, but he's King of the nations. His inscription, King of the Jews, is written in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek. And here we see a little foreshadowing of how Jesus, as King of the Jews, dying on the cross, will be written someday in every language, for every nation, because he's King of kings and Lord of lords. And it is our job to inscribe in every nation, in every tongue, in every language, Jesus, King of the Jews and King of the nations, for their language, so that they too can experience the power of Jesus bringing them into his kingdom. And so it is our job to make verse 20 happen, as we have guys like John Smedley doing over in Cambodia, so that every nation can praise Jesus in their own language, because they have seen Jesus in their own language, King of the nations, dying on the cross. And we know that this will happen because in Revelation 5, we're told that every tongue, tribe, and nation will be praising and falling down to the Lamb who is slain. And so Pilate writes this inscription, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. But you notice the Jews don't like it in verse 21. So the chief priests and the Jews said to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but rather this man said, I am King of the Jews. Right? Because they feel the embarrassment. They're like, he's not really King of the Jews. He said he's King of the Jews. But Pilate, after like a long argument with the Jews, trying to release him on multiple occasions, but being blackmailed by the Jews, trying to release him, but the Jews won't let him go, stirring up a riot if he won't let Jesus go. And so Pilate, basically, he's had enough. He wants to get out of this. And so he says, what I've written, I've written. I want you to notice the judicial nature of this term. What I've written, I've written. How many of you know that legal work includes writing? Everything has to be wrote out, right? When it comes to legality. And I just want you to see the legalness, the judicialness of Jesus dying here. Down to the last word written down, God oversaw the fact that Jesus would be crucified honestly, in the sense that he was being condemned as King of the Jews. Not as he said he was King of the Jews, but because he was King of the Jews. Because Jesus is seeking to justify us here at the cross. In the New Testament, we're told that we're justified through the blood of Jesus. And in the gospel of Jesus, you see, right, all this trial take place. It's all in trial format. Through the two greatest courts of that day, the Jewish Sanhedrin, which would have been like the Jewish Supreme Court, and then the Roman court, both merging together in order to crucify Jesus and put him to death. It's all legal. Pilate, right, the judge put over Jesus, says multiple times, I find no guilt in him, I find no guilt in him, I find no guilt in him. So even that, you just see the whole judicial scene working out. So Jesus, sarcastically and hatefully, is put to death through the Jews and Pilate. Neither of them believe who he is. But God works it out and orchestrates it out in such a way where down to the last sentence, the last word, to the last inscription, Jesus is being crucified as King of the Jews so that he can justify us. And so I want to end with this question. Is this folly to you? Is this power to you? In Romans 3:26, we're told that God would be just and justifier to the one who has faith in him, in Jesus. And you see in this gospel account that God is just in taking our place to justify us from our guilt. He's not overlooking our sin because that would be cheating. But he's just. He's doing it in the right way. He's just and he's justifier. So that we would be justified. That means to be declared righteous even though we've sinned. But the only way he could do that is not let us off the hook and say, I'll let you go. But he had to pay our penalty, right? He had to die in our place. And you just see God meticulously working that out for us because it doesn't matter how you feel about your sin. The fact is that Jesus took your place, and as Romans 8:1 says, we now have no condemnation if we're in Christ Jesus. That's great news. But I want to ask you, is this folly to you? If you're perishing, that would mean I don't get it. I don't need that. A king on a cross, what a ridiculous image. And if that means nothing to you, then it's because you're perishing. But for us, church, it's the power of God. Because there's nothing more powerful than saving me, truly, in a fair, true, honest, judicial way. And that's what Jesus does on the cross. And he changes us. And so now I want to give RJ an opportunity to give his testimony. And he's going to just be sharing how this gospel message changes us. And it's not just for back then. It is powerful for today. It's still power for those who believe. And so, RJ.
Is this mic on? Yeah, it is. I'm going to bring a stand up here because it gets up higher. How y'all doing today? Good? All right. That's what I like to hear. All right, so some of you know a little bit about my testimony. Some of you have heard it before, but most of you haven't. If you've heard it before, just hang in there and don't tune me out Maybe consider you weren't listening the first time or that you missed something, okay? So when I first heard the gospel, I had a mentor, and he told me that I would either do great things for God or great things for Satan, okay? And back then, I just thought it was something special. I thought, man, I'm going to do great things for God or great things for Satan. Man, what's God got in store? But I started to realize that that wasn't the case. I think that's true of all of us, okay? We can either choose God or reject him. We can either choose good or evil. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, what you've done or what you haven't done. You see, it wasn't that I was anything special or anything. It wasn't that I was unique for whatever reason. It's because we all got to make a choice. And that choice is either to accept God or to reject him. Jesus will cause you to do either great things for God or great things for Satan. That choice to accept him or reject him. What I've come to realize is that my story, it's no different than any of yours. While there may have been more drama and trauma in my life, that doesn't make it unique or special. It doesn't make my testimony any better or any more powerful than anyone else's either. Not only does God accept us as we are, but he uses us as we are as well. He can use your testimony in ways that you've never even dreamed of. When I say that my story is no different than any of yours, what I mean by that is this: every single one of us in here are lost people. Every single one of us. And we are wicked sinners. We need a Savior. If you know Jesus today, that's your story. You've been redeemed from the pits of hell. We all need to be redeemed because each of our hearts are desperately wicked and deceitful above all things. Jeremiah 17:9. What I want to talk to you today about is submission. Sure, I'm here to tell you my story, but that's what my story is all about. It's about submission. Several years ago, I was doing a discipleship study with a mentor of mine, and I was tasked to write out my testimony in just a couple words. So that was really hard for me. For one, my life story is really long. And to be truthful, it's really crazy. And let's be honest, if you know me, I can talk on and on and on forever. Just ask Jason McFadden or Aaron or anybody who spends any time on the phone with me. Trust me, I will keep you on there. So, in here I was tasked to sum it up just in a few words. And I thought about this for days, and as I replayed certain events in my mind over and over, a pattern started to emerge. And God, he started to show me just what I needed to see. It was like a light bulb came on in my mind. And my story, my testimony, it was simply this. It was God's relentless pursuit of a man. No matter where I looked in my life, if I was being objective about the situations, I was able to see him pursuing me through every single bit of it. Didn't matter what it was. I was able to see God lead me to that point of submission. And I dwelt on that for a long time, and what I realized was that God does that to each of us. He is a relentless pursuer of all of us. The thought of losing you drove him to sacrifice his only son to die a horrible death. Horrible death. Just so he can have a shot at a relationship with you. But you must choose him. You have to submit. I was born in some pretty bad circumstances. My mom, she was really young, and so was my dad. So in all fairness to them, they didn't have a clue how to take care of a baby. They were kids themselves, all trying, they were all alone trying to take care of me. Early on, my father got locked up and he got sent to prison. I don't think I was more than a few months old when he went away. And my mom, she was 16 years old at the time. So she ended up getting into a series of really bad, violent relationships. At some point in the first year of my life, I was taken away from my mother and put into the foster care system. So by the time I was 5 years old, I had been bounced around place to place for quite a bit. So the crazy thing, they take you away from your mom or your dad or wherever the situation is in order to protect you. But the reality was I was in far more danger in the places that I lived at than I would have been with her. And, in those places, I endured every kind of abuse that you could think of pretty much on a daily basis. So I was 5 years old when my mom gave up all her legal rights to me. And at that point, I became what was known as a ward of the state. So, needless to say, I was a very angry kid. I think a lot of it was because of all the abuse I had endured and all the violence I had witnessed all around me. I wouldn't let anyone get close to me. Looking back, I just didn't think. Looking back, I just didn't want to get hurt anymore. And I became very violent with people around me. Because of it, the state, they pulled me out of the foster care system and they just put me in group homes or psych hospitals, wherever they had a bed. That's where I would stay. And I just bounced around place to place. And through all of it, the crazy thing was there was always some sort of church influence. And I never really did hear the gospel message or much about Jesus, but I heard about God and I heard about love. And looking back, I just think God was laying that foundation. Remember what I said about relentless pursuit? He was pursuing me even when I had no clue who he was. He kept me in the palm of his hand and he protected me. When I was 7 years old, I was sent to live with a family in New Jersey, and it's called a pre-adoptive home. So these people basically, they take you into their home, they see if it's a good fit, and if it's a good fit, they adopt you. So I had already been in one of these situations about a year or so prior when I was 6 years old, and it was a super bad situation, not good at all. And here I was put into another one, and I just didn't know how to react to it. Looking back, these people, they wanted to get me involved in their family. They wanted to love me and all that stuff, but I didn't have a clue how to receive that. I had no idea. And because of the wall that I built around me in order to not get hurt again, it caused me to be very violent with them. One day, they just loaded me up into a car, dropped me off at this psych hospital, and they said, we'll be back in a week to pick you up. And I never saw them again. So I was 8 years old by this time, and this situation had played out twice in my life already. I didn't know how to handle it, and I lost it. So I thought my only option was to kill myself over and over again. At 8 years old, I tried to commit suicide. And the hospital staff, they just ended up keeping me strapped to a bed in 5-point restraints for weeks. I just remember bawling like a little baby, those heavy, heaving sobs. And at some point, I started to ask God, why me? Why can't I be like the other kids, God? Why can't I be normal? Why me? I'll never forget that moment. The reason I won't ever forget it isn't because of how traumatic the situation was. It was because of the peace that just washed over me as soon as I finished those words. Back then, I had no clue what it was. I had no idea. But looking back on it now, I know that God just wrapped me in his arms in that moment, and he held me tight. I can't explain the feeling. It was just this intense peace. And the light was so bright and warm. And in that moment, I knew everything was going to be okay. Even though things like that continued on for a long time, I remember holding on to that moment. God was pursuing me even then. Eventually, I did get adopted. It wasn't the most ideal situation. In fact, it was pretty bad itself. Once again, I was faced with a lot of abuse, and I was heading into my teen years, and I had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So I had to start taking medication for it, but the crazy thing was I'd always forget to take them stupid pills. And it just bad situation. So despite all that, I learned that God has a reason for anything. God has a reason for everything. So had I not been adopted, and had I not moved to state college, I never would have heard the true gospel. I never would have met two of the most amazing people I've ever met in my life. Two people that would just consistently show me what God's unconditional love is. And to this day, I still affectionately call them mom and dad. Some of y'all have met them. They've been here. I think mom's probably watching on a screen right now. I first responded to the gospel when I was 18 years old. So at that point, I knew who Jesus was, but I couldn't say I had a real relationship with him or that I had submitted my life into him. I think I accepted Christ for the sake of others around me, to please them. And you could tell by the way I lived my life. I had one foot in church, one foot in drugs, crime, women, you name it. I was living for me. I was doing things that way because that's what I wanted. I was the biggest hypocrite you ever met. I used to tell people, if you'd have looked up the definition of hypocrite in the dictionary, you'd have seen my face. That's how much of a hypocrite I was. Back then, at that point, I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic. At another point, I was working in youth ministry and as a worship leader of a church. But the whole time, I was living this double life. The drugs became a huge problem, and in order to get money to supply the habit, I would rob and steal from people. So I was 22 the first time I went to state prison, 22 years old. At first, things didn't go well for me because I was fighting all the time. You gotta think about how I grew up. I grew up in institutions, and so to me, that's just what happened, man. You're fighting all the time, and I ended up doing like 2 years in solitary confinement. It was like plus or minus 2 years. And in the midst of all that, I was studying the Bible. I was taking college classes through Moody Bible Institute. I was involved in a very intense daily Bible study that challenged my thinking. And I stopped fighting all the time as I focused more on this stuff. And looking back on this, though, I realize now that I was only learning about Jesus. It all became a knowledge pursuit for me. It was all up here, and it didn't transfer to here. And that's the most important thing. It's got to transfer to your heart. But for me, it was right up here. And if you'd have asked me back then, I would have told you that I was sold out to Jesus. I was sold out to him, and I loved him. But there was still no level of submission to God and his will for me evidenced in my life. When I left prison, I immediately went to work for a very large church in my hometown. They had paid for my education through Moody. They invested very heavily in mentoring me while I was in prison. I started working in youth ministry, children's ministry, and as a worship leader. So things seemed to be going well. As I worked hard on my job, I was successful in maintaining my sobriety. Everything on the outside appeared right, but inside, I was a hot mess. The reason I was such a mess was because I was still doing things the way I wanted to do them. I was still doing it on my own. I connected with God through music, but aside from that, my spiritual life didn't exist. And eventually, I couldn't even connect with him through music. A lot of that was because I was living my life the way I wanted to, and I was compromising in all these different areas. Once again, I was living that double life, but it wasn't as extreme as it had been before. At least it wasn't at first. And that's how it works, though. People don't just fall off the edge all at once. It happens a tiny bit at a time. A little compromise here, a little compromise there, and then it downward spirals. Eventually, I found myself back in the grips of drug addiction. And this time, it got really bad really quick, though. During this time in my life, I met my wife. I met Kristen. And marrying her was, I'm telling you, it's the smartest thing I ever did. And I'm not saying that just because she's sitting here. It's literally the smartest thing I ever did. So she had never been around that kind of stuff before and really didn't have any idea what was going on. She knew something was wrong. She knew something was going on, but she couldn't figure out what it was. And all the time, I think she just knew the man she married wasn't the same, and he was going downhill very quickly. My addiction became so bad that I resorted to a life of crime to supply my growing habit, and I completely walked away from everything I knew and loved. God, he wasn't even a thought in my mind. It just got incredibly dark, and I mean dark. My wife, she became pregnant. During all this time, and about 3 months into the pregnancy, I was arrested and sent back to prison. I couldn't be there to see my baby girl be born or help my wife through it all. It crushed me, and it made me very bitter and angry. My heart was so dark that I was numb to all of it. Life went on like that for a while, but then the most amazing thing happened. I met my daughter when she was 18 months old. And as I held this precious child in my arms, it was like a lightning bolt hit me. And God just spoke directly to me, and he said, man, life ain't about you anymore, man. It's about this little girl. I was so self-centered at that point in my life. God was telling me, see, you need to be better for this child. You need to be a better man for this little girl. And it's not like the change was overnight, but what happened was God poked a hole into the darkness of my heart. Do you remember what I told you about the heart is desperately wicked and deceitful above all things? That's how Satan works. I didn't even know there was a problem. I didn't know my heart was dark and evil. But what happened was, in that time, he poked a little bit of light into that darkness. And that tiny bit of light shined on everything. And that was the starting point. And over the next few years, God would continue to poke more holes in my heart. Well, you need to be a better man for your wife. Okay, well now, you've been doing that for a while. You need to be a better man for your community. And then years go by, and he says, you need to be a better man for yourself because you're worth it. And slowly but surely, God started to transform my heart, and he started to soften me. During this time, I refocused myself on him and my faith because I knew he was my only hope. The only problem is that I was still doing things my own way. And this was never more evident when I got into a fight on Easter Sunday of 2016. I sat there in the hole in solitary confinement, and God shattered my heart. Here I was in prison. That's not a double negative. I was in prison, facing new charges, facing a transfer. And God just shattered me. I mean, he broke my heart. And he just said, this is really how far you are away from me. And you've squandered your time here. What have you done? And that was it. I was done. I was done running. For the first time in my life, I told him, here I am. I'm broken. Here I am. No matter how high you take me, no matter how low you take me, I don't care. Do with me what you will. Do what you got to do. I'll follow you anywhere. I meant it. I was done trying to do everything on my own, and I knew above all else that I needed him to rule my life because I couldn't do it, and I'd proven that time and time again. Since then, God's been changing my heart and transforming me in ways that I've never thought possible. There was so much bitterness and anger he had to help me work through, and now he continues to work and make me the man he desires me to be. He took a man who didn't care about anything other than himself and gave him an intense love for others and serving them. He took a bitter, angry man and made him full of joy, and he couldn't have done that without submission. It's the same for each of us. Each of our stories are the same. You and I were just broken people. We're being pursued by a relentless God. And it's up to us to give in to that pursuit so he can do what he desires. His grace and mercy are infinite, and he'll never stop chasing you. That grace and mercy is made available to each of us through Jesus Christ. Each one of you here will do great things. Great things. Has anyone ever told you that? Man, it don't matter how old you are or how young you are. It don't matter what your situation is. Man, you're going to do great things. It's just a matter of who you're going to do them for. Are you going to do them for God, or are you going to do them for Satan? How are you going to respond to that? And what will you choose? Will you choose God? Will you reject him? I don't know what you're going through today. I don't know what your life looks like. I don't know what the situation is, what your marriage looks like, job life, school life, whatever it is, man. I don't know, but God does. He knows. He knows exactly what you're dealing with, what you're going through. And he's pursuing you through all of it. He accepts you just as you are. And even now, he's pursuing you just as he pursued me. And my prayer for you, though, is that you don't have to go through what I did. You don't have to go as low as I did to reach that point where you say, man, whatever you got to do, whatever you got to do. I'm not saying everything's going to change and everything's going to be fixed immediately. But he will be able to start to work. He will be able to start to do what he wants to do. And he loves you. Know that today. He loves you. And he wants to change you. We're going to have the musicians come up real quick. I know we're running late. We'll be fast. Listen, if you are in that place where, one, either you don't know Jesus or you are straddling that fence. You're doing things on your own. Life is just, and there ain't no mystery. If you're asking yourself, have I been doing it? Have I been, you know. It ain't no mystery. You know. I mean, if you know you ain't been giving him your all, man, I just ask that you do some business with God today. I'm not asking you to come up here or anything like that. I'm just saying, wherever you're at, just do business with God. Just pray. Just tell him, here I am. Do what you got to do. There's people in here that will pray for you, and I'm begging you, don't leave here till you pray for them. We got the elders. If the elders can stand up, elders, deacons, deaconesses, Miss Phyllis, Miss Hazel, these are prayer warriors. This isn't all of them in here, but these are people that would be willing to pray for you. Don't leave here without praying for someone if you've really chosen to come to him.